Salvece discipuli, welcome to Latin for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily translation. Today's text comes from the poetry of Gaius Valerius Catullus, and it's one of his most famous works. Catullus' plain style and deeply emotional content make it accessible even for intermediate audiences, and it's really great for classroom engagement to mention that Catullus wouldn't have been much older than a present-day college student when he wrote these words. So I'd say that this would be an appropriate poem to set in front of a second-year Latin class as their first exposure. Ooh, not that one. Here we are. Catullus Carmen V. Before I get too deep into it, I'll just read through the poem in Latin. Although I'll try to give a sense of what it might have sounded like in Catullus' time, bear in mind that I'm not a native Latin speaker, so pardon my accent. Vivamus me lesbia quamemus, rumoresque sinem severiorum, omnes unis aestimemus assis. Soles occidere et ridire possunt, nobis cum semel occidit brevis lux. Nox est perpetuum dormienda. Dami basia mille, dien decentum, dien mille altera, dien secunda centum, dien dusque altera mille, dien decentum, dien cum millia multa feceremus, conturbabimus illa, ne sciamus, aut ne quis malus invidere possit, cum tantum siat esse basiorum. As far as the meter goes, there's nothing too crazy going on here, just your typical hendecasyllabic verse that I'm sure you've all seen 100 times. Catullus, of course, was very fond of this, and it features in many of his poems. I'll start off with this text from Wikisource that helpfully has all the vowels that are long by nature already marked, and now here's my completed scansion. If you want, you can pause the video to review it and check your own work. A couple of things to note. First, you can see how the metrical pattern for each line that I've put on screen has the first two syllables marked by an X. This indicates that those syllables are anceps. In other words, they could be either long or short. In this poem, every line starts with a spondi, i.e. both the first and second syllables are long. This is fairly representative of Catullus. We all know that he loved his spondis, and he only sporadically took advantage of the liberty afforded in each of these syllables in his works. In contrast, you can see that the last syllable of many of these lines of this poem is marked short, even though, according to the metrical pattern, they should be long. This is an example of brevis in longo, in which, as the name suggests, the final syllable of a line can be counted as long, even if it would normally be short. This results from the natural pause between lines when a passage is read. I've gone back and forth with myself about what I think is the best way to mark these syllables in a way that makes sense in a scansion, and I decided that it makes the most sense to mark them as short and just let the reader understand that these syllables would be read as long. And now for the translation. I'll try to highlight both the grammar points and the most poetic effects that stood out to me. Vivamus me lesbia, let us live, my lesbia. Atquamemus, and let us love. The first line starts off with two subjunctive mood verbs, but we'll need to wait until the third line in order to see the third verb that finishes this sentence. I want everybody to pay attention to the meter here, how it too echoes this pace. We can see that there's a double elision in line 1, where the final vowel of lesbia merges with the initial vowel in atque, and then the same thing happens right afterwards with atque and amemus. So these three words would have been pronounced together like lesbiatque memus. Elisions have the poetic effect of speeding up the reading, which is very much in keeping with the theme of this line. Becoming so excited at the first mention of his lover's name that he wants to speed up is certainly something Catullus would have done. But let's take a look at the next few words. Rumoresque sinem severiorum, and we'll throw in omnes from the next line because it goes with rumores. All the rumors. Likewise, senem goes with severiorum, more strict old men, which tends to throw off some students. Senex is a third declension noun, so its genitive plural looks like that, as opposed to the more familiar form of the first and second declension nouns that you see on severiorum. This arrangement, where two pairs of adjectives and two pairs of nouns appear in this order, is called chiasmus. This literary device is used much more often in Latin than it is in English, which has a much more rigid word order. As such, the effects are harder for English speakers to appreciate. Notice how the more strict old men are quite literally in the center of all the rumors, surrounded by them. In contrast, Catullus has chosen in the first line to surround his lesbia with life and love. From a metrical perspective, we can see how much the pace has slowed down. There are only 3 words in this line. All of the rumors of more strict old men is certainly something that might slow our young lovers down a bit. We can also see that line 2 ends with severiorum, and the line after that begins with omnes. But because of how final M's were pronounced in Latin, these 2 words could have been elided together, and indeed, if they appeared together in the same line, they probably would have been. Severiorum omnes. but elisions that cross a metrical line are very rare in Roman poetry, similar to hiatus of an elision that could have taken place within a line. And so we can see that the chiastic arrangement of these words has stopped an elision that otherwise might have occurred, slowing down the pace of the verse, just like the old men's rumors slowed down the lovers. Now you can see that this line is also one of the ones that features a breus in longo, which heightens this effect, since the final syllable of suerion would need to be pronounced long. Needing to change how a word is pronounced just to fit within some made-up rules of meter really does seem fitting for the more strict old men too, doesn't it? Unius aestimemus Assis. Assis is another word that tends to trip up a lot of students. It comes from as, a third declension noun referring to a low-valued coin. As you can see more plainly from unius, Assis is in the genitive singular. In contrast to most genitive forms, this one is not possessive. Rather, with aestimare, the value attached to the estimate takes on the genitive or sometimes ablative case. You might imagine, let us assign a value of a single as a translation that matches the grammar of the original Latin. And speaking of asses, since this was a bronze or copper coin of low value, many contemporary translations of this poem render this word as penny, or the translator's national equivalent. I guess that's okay, but it risks losing some of the poetic charm of this line. As comes from ais iris, which is the word for bronze, but that word is also etymologically related to aestimare. The most common explanation for the origin of that word is ais plus temus, a root coming from the Proto-Indo-European tem, to cut. Cutting bronze referred to the process of minting money, and this relationship is simply lost when translating this word as penny, which shares no linguistic connection to esteem or evaluate. And for this reason, I like to leave this as the Latin word in my translation of this line, in order to at least preserve the phonological similarity between these words. Another reason I like to do this is I like to imagine the repeated S sounds in this line and the previous omnis unius aestimemus Assis might be meant to suggest the hisses of disapproval from the senum sueriorum. Soles occidere ridire possunt. This line is a real breath of fresh air for young translators, since it comprises a relatively straightforward sentence self-contained within a single line. In contrast to the previous passage, the tone of the poem shifts as well, along with the topic. Suns can rise and set. Actually, that's backwards. The stock phrase in English has the sun rising and setting in that order, but as you can see, the word corresponding to set appears first here. Now, I'm not sure whether this is because a Latin speaker would customarily have these words in that order, or if it's because it fits better with the meaning that Catullus wanted to convey, but either way, it's worthy of note, and it warrants a translation that fits the same order. I'd also like to draw some attention to the specific word for set, occidere. It can mean to fall down, as here, but you might be more familiar with another arguably more common meaning of this word. It often refers to death, both dying and also the act of killing someone. In contrast, redire is simply re, a prefix with precisely the same meaning as it has in English, plus ire, to go. So Catullus is using a much more vivid and active word for the setting, to die, as opposed to the rising, simply to go again. Now let's take a look at the next two lines together. Nobis cum semel occidit reus lux, nox est perpetuuna dormienda. Now here we see Latin's freer word order again. We'll start with cum. Now, this isn't the cum that you're probably used to seeing, the preposition that means with. Here, cum is a conjunction with the meaning of after or when, and we'll talk a lot more about cum in the following lines. Simul is another word that sometimes falls outside a student's vocabulary. It means something like once, often with a connotation reflecting the finality of something only happening one time. Something that's certainly appropriate for the semantic meaning of these lines. Despite its ending, breus goes with lux, not nobis. Third declension nominative forms are less organized than the rules of some TCGs, am I right? Even with Latin's freer word ordering, putting the subject at the end of a clause is certainly not usual, and this was almost definitely done for poetic effect. Note how lux is placed directly before nox in the next line. This positioning heightens the already implied contrast between them. Note also how the choice of verb, occidere, ties this line with the previous one. This time around, the reference to death is made explicit, while suns are able to rise and fall again. When our brief light fades, there is an eternal night to sleep through. Our isn't necessarily the most rigorous translation for nobis from a grammatical standpoint, since it's in the dative or maybe ablative case rather than the genitive. Still, I imagine that it's in the dative in reference to the brief light that is given to Catullus and Lesbia, so I think that translation is suitable. It's kind of interesting how, for the second part of this thought, this time it's English that shifts the position of the subject. Nox is in the nominative case, but it's very difficult to put together a natural-sounding English translation with night as the first word. Una and perpetua are both adjectives referring to night, nothing super crazy there, but dormienda is a predicative gerundive formed from dormire, to sleep. So it's used as an adjective with the meaning of slept, with some sense of obligation, so like a night that needs to be slept. I know this might seem like some heavy Latin grammar, but it's actually a concept that should be familiar to most English speakers. Consider the word dividend from dividendum, something to be divided, i.e. among shareholders, or memorandum, literally a thing to be remembered. Likewise, the name Amanda comes from amare, a woman to be loved. And next up is most probably the famous line in the poem, and a strong contender for the most famous in Catullus' entire canon. Da mi pasia mille, diendecentum. Give me 1,000 kisses, and then 100. Nothing crazy about the grammar here, just note that mille, like all Latin numbers greater than 3, does not change its form to agree with its noun, regardless of case or gender. Dien millaltra, dien secundecentum. Again, grammatically, nothing special, but notice that there are different words used for then and a different structure in the line. Diendus qualtra mille, diendecentum. And I admit, when I was a student, I did kind of poo-poo this passage for basically saying the same thing 3 times, just with different words. Let's appreciate the arrangement, though. Catullus uses repetition to show what, in words, he means to do with Lesbia. Also, the first line has no elisions, the second has 1, and the third has 2. The pace of the lines is speeding up. I'll leave it to the audience to speculate on what deeper meaning that might refer to. And dien cum milia multa feceremus. This is the same cum we saw before, meaning when. It's the same mille we saw earlier too, meaning 1,000. Now, hold on, Dave, I can already hear some of you screaming at your screens. Didn't I say that this word isn't declined? Well, okay, there's a little bit of an asterisk for that. When it's used as an adjective to describe how many of something there are, it isn't declined. When it's used as a noun to mean a set containing 1,000 of something, it is. This form is in the accusative case, which is fitting because it's the object of feceremus. Now, facere is already an interesting verb with flexible meaning. The general meaning is to do or to make, but it's used idiomatically with a number of nouns, e.g. pacem facere, to make peace, indicium facere, to disclose a secret, basium facere, to kiss a kiss. It doesn't have quite the same ring to it in English, does it? The fact that we use the same word kiss to describe the action as a verb and a noun makes a literal translation sound unnatural. When we have completed many thousands, we'll mix them up, I guess. Finally, I think it's worth diving a bit into the grammar surrounding the form of feceremus. As you probably already know if you've been a fan of the channel for a while, the future perfect indicative and the perfect subjunctive are pretty similar. There's no difference in form except in the first person singular for most verbs, including this one. Therefore, we need to go by context to determine the intended reading. Now, sometimes this is straightforward. For example, if the verb is in a clause that requires the subjunctive, we can infer the subjunctive. Cum, however, is able to take verbs in both the indicative and subjunctive moods. A temporal cum clause, one that simply states the time when something happens without implying any sort of relationship between the two events, takes a verb in the indicative mood, whereas a cum clause with circumstantial, causal, or concessive implications takes the subjunctive. To clarify a little bit, let's take a look at a concrete example, the sentence I just said. A temporal cum clause uses the indicative mood, whereas a concessive cum clause takes the subjunctive. Now, if you were going to translate that into Latin, the first part, a temporal cum clause uses the indicative mood, well, that would be the independent clause, whereas a concessive cum clause takes the subjunctive would be the subordinate clause. Notice the concessive relationship between these two. The purpose of that sentence is to express the incompatibility between these two ideas. And so the verb in that subordinate clause would be in the subjunctive mood. Cum is often translated as whereas or nevertheless when used concessively like this. I'd say it's pretty clear from the intended meaning of the sentence that there certainly is meant to be a relationship between feceremus and conturbabimus, though not a concessive one, probably more like a circumstantial or perhaps even causal. After we've kissed many thousands of times, we will mix them up. Or perhaps because we have kissed many thousands of times, we will mix them up. I've seen both readings among the translations that I've read from my colleagues, but the circumstantial seems to be more prevalent. And they are all united, though, in reading feceremus as a subjunctive mood verb. I don't think I've ever seen someone try to translate that passage using the indicative. And this is something that's a little bit difficult for me to get my head around as a non-native Latin speaker, especially given that in English the subjunctive mood isn't really a thing, certainly not to the extent that it is in Latin. But I can't help but thinking this ambiguity was part of what Catullus was hoping to achieve with his choice of words. Even the ambiguity in whether vicaremus is subjunctive, which carries with it a feeling of potentiality, versus indicative, which would imply that these words were grounded in established fact, is a bit blurry. Recall that in the first person singular, the verb forms are distinct, meaning that if Catullus had worded this passage a bit differently, say, when I have kissed you many thousands of times, this beautiful poetic effect disappears. It's crazy to see how just one word could make such a big difference. I'd be interested to hear from some of my international viewers, particularly those who speak a language like German, which makes much more extensive use of the subjunctive, deal with this passage in their translations of this poem. Now, if all that went way over your head, don't worry. I promise that's the hardest grammar that I'll be talking about today. Let's take a look at the next passage. We will mix them up. Conturbare has the meaning of to mix up or to throw into confusion. Various commentators have interpreted this as being accomplished figuratively by continuing to produce a multitude of additional unnumbered kisses, or more literally, by violently shaking the beads of an abacus. But why would they need to do that in the first place? Ne sciamus, so that we will not know, aut ne quis malus invidere possit, or rather, so that anyone evil cannot envy, cum tantum scia esse basiorum, when he knows how many kisses there were. Invidere is a compound of in plus videre, literally to look on. Some commentators connect this to an ancient Roman and Near East superstition that you could place some kind of a curse on somebody by looking on them with an evil eye, but only if you had an exact account of what they had done. Such meaning was quite possibly intended by the poet, but is almost invariably lost on modern audiences without some sort of a footnote, so I like to just leave in the basic meaning for this line in my translation. I'll point out that this isn't particularly compatible with the figurative reading of conturbare that I mentioned earlier, because giving Lesbia an untold number of additional kisses doesn't really do anything to erase the jealousy that might result in other people. On the other hand, it does fit with the literal meaning of obliterating the record of their amorous deeds. The last line does have a bit more advanced grammar than the two preceding ones, so I'll go through step by step. We can see that this is another cum clause, our third time with cum after the occurrences in line 5 and 10. Scia is unambiguously in the subjunctive mood this time, third person singular present active subjunctive to be precise, of scire, to know. As noted before, cum clauses with a causal, circumstantial, or concessive nature use a verb in the subjunctive mood, and that's what's going on here. When he knows, or perhaps better, because he knows, tantum is the accusative case with the infinitive esse, because this subordinate clause uses indirect discourse. Recall that this grammatic construct is used with verbs of speaking, believing, knowing, as is the case here, and the like. Now, before you call me a dirty reneger on my promise to keep the grammar a bit lighter from now on, I'll point out that this sort of construction is actually one that's made its way into English. For example, consider the sentence, David considers her to be a good judge of character. Not sure what other type of judge that might refer to. Even though English doesn't decline nouns the way that Latin does, you can clearly see that the accusative form of the third person singular feminine pronoun is used in this sentence. It wouldn't be right to say, I consider she to be a good, well, anything. I guess this makes sense because her functions similar to the object of the verb of the main clause. And likewise, when Latin uses indirect discourse, the subject of the subordinate clause appears in the accusative case. The verb of the subordinate clause then is in the infinitive, just like in the example English sentence that I shared earlier. Esse normally means to be, but with indirect discourse, it's translated as a normal indicative, i.e. just is or are. Finally, basiorum is in the genitive case, as an example of a partitive genitive, also called a genitive of the whole. It indicates that the kisses are what the tantum is composed of. Unlike some other languages, Latin does not have a special partitive case, and it uses the genitive for this purpose. Consider the English phrases, one word of the passage, or a deck of cards, or 3 of the lines, for some examples of this kind of grammatical structure in English. And all of these factors together make a strict translation of the last line that both sounds natural and faithfully preserves the grammar of the original Latin quite difficult to construct. The best I could do would be something like, because he knows how much the quantity of kisses is. A more normal translation of tantum is simply how much, without the quantity that I took the liberty of adding in. But like I said, expect a few compromises. And with that, we're done. Now that we have all that set, I'd like to close out by taking a quick look at some of the features of the poem as a whole that contribute to the effects. For one, if you look at the verbs in this poem, you'll see that Catullus starts out with the subjunctive mood and then switches to the indicative and then to the imperative during the climactic lines of the poem, da mi basia mille et al. Afterwards, he switches back to the subjunctive with only one word in the indicative, conturbabimus, for the rest of the poem. In fact, if feceremus was in the indicative mood, we would have a nice, perfectly symmetrical structure, something that I take as further evidence that Catullus intended a bit of ambiguity there. I'll leave it to the comments section to discuss what sort of meaning could be imputed with this structure, starting out with the potentiality of the subjunctive, moving to the actuality of the indicative, climaxing with the immediacy of the imperative mood before falling relatively quickly back down to the subjunctive where we first started. Another thing that stuck out to me is that nearly every line in this poem ends with the brevis in longo. That is, the last syllable of every line would normally be read short and is only long by nature of the brief pause that naturally occurs between lines. The only exceptions are in line 4 and 5, two lines in which Catullus poignantly conveys the horrifying reality that a missed opportunity might turn into a regret the lovers must bear for the remainder of their earthly lives. The artificial lengthening of the final syllables was used elsewhere for poetic effect, as discussed earlier, but the natural length of the final two syllables in particular serves to create a nice contrast. And that's all I have for today. Hopefully I've been able to give you a decent sampling of this beautiful poetic devices used in this verse, subject to the constraints of reading poetry and translation. In fact, that's one of the biggest things that I wanted to get across in this video, just how much is going on under the hood, even in a relatively straightforward poem such as this one, that really eludes the modern audience for no other reason than that it's in a foreign language. Now, this is one reason that language learning really appeals to me. In my mind, it's impossible to fully appreciate any literary work without some understanding of the language it's written in. And that goes double for poetry, which by definition makes use of elements other than the strict semantic properties of the words to create meaning. Join me again next time for another daily translation. And in case anyone thinks I'm less of a man because I analyzed a poem with many thousands of kisses, I will...
You know, I sometimes like to think about how my channel might have turned out if I had pursued some of my other non-magic related hobbies and interests. You might not know this about me, but I have almost a decade of experience studying Latin through grade school, high school, college, and in self-guided learning. I'm not what I would consider fluent in any language besides English, but in addition to Latin, I've studied 3 other languages in either a classroom or serious self-directed setting. And the foundations that I learned studying Latin were invaluable to me in ways that I never would have considered. Like language learning, the thing that I like most about Magic is not the gameplay or the collectible aspect, but rather the global appeal and the opportunities it offers to form connections with people all over the world. In fact, the first non-contrived Portuguese and Mandarin sentences that I was able to read all the way through were both the flavor text of Magic cards, a fact that made last year's announcement that Magic would cease to be localized into both of those languages particularly painful for me. Now, as a Magic player and a YouTuber, I'm excited to be part of a worldwide community and to have a channel that can reach people across the world. Those of you who watch my videos, you are the reason that I do what I do, especially those of you who live so far away that it's unlikely we'll ever meet in person. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Huh. Am I the only one who's feeling some serious deja vu right now?